Ladies and gentlemen, let's get into the video. We're going to be talking about AMD's Computex event once again, specifically over a controversy that was shown off during the stream. So, to get everyone up to the same page, during AMD's Computex stream, they of course unveiled the RX 480, which is based upon the Polaris architecture. They shown off various benchmarks and obviously got various industry professionals to wax lyrically about the upcoming architecture, but one of the things they did do was tell us that the RX 480 in CrossFire can outperform the GTX 1080 in various games. What they used to demonstrate this was Ashes of the Singularity. They put a system together which was an i7-5930K, 32GB of memory, a high-end motherboard, Windows 10 and all of the other bits and pieces you'd assume that would be in a high-end system, as well as the relevant driver versions. And then they ran a series of benchmarks, one on a GTX 1080, which managed to achieve 58.7 frames per second, and one on two RX 480s, which achieved 62.5 frames a second, in other words, faster. However, it didn't stop there. AMD then told us that obviously the RX 480s were cheaper, and also told us that the GPU utilization of the RX 480s was less. So what they then said, of course, is that if you optimized further, there was more room left in the tank in the RX 480 configuration, therefore theoretically you should be able to get more performance down the line if developers, for example, or AMD themselves were better to optimize the drivers. Now, in-game configuration was crazy settings, 1080p, 8x MSAA, and VSync was disabled. However, there were some visual differences between the two videos which were shown. Now, AMD did say that those videos were obviously tested live, but Robert Halleck has decided to comment on this. He is the Chief Technical Marketing over at AMD, and once again he did decide to tell us via Reddit what's happening. So I'm going to read out the pertinent part of the quote because it's pretty long, and I'm not going to go through the entire system specifications and all of that jazz because it's on screen. The elephant in the room. Ashes uses procedural generation based upon randomized seed at launch. The benchmark does look slightly different every time it's run, but that, as many have noted, does not fully explain the differences people have noticed. At present, the GTX 1080 is incorrectly executing the terrain shaders responsible for the population, the environment, with the appropriate amounts of snow. The GTX 1080 is doing less work to render Ashes of the Singularity than otherwise would if shaders are being run properly. Snow is looking somewhat flat and boring in colour compared to shiny rocks, which gives the illusion that less is being rendered. And this is incorrect interpretation of how terrain shaders are functioning in this title. The content being rendered by the RX 480, the one with the greatest snow coverage, side by side, is the correct execution of terrain shaders. So, even with the fudgy image quality, God, if I can speak that would help, image quality of the GTX 1080 that could improve their performance a few percent, dual RX 480s still came out ahead. On a parting note, I would also mention that we ran this test 10 times prior to going on stage to confirm the performance delta was accurate, and moving up to 1440p at the same settings maintains the same performance delta within plus or minus 1%, end quote. So immediately after these allegations were made, folks on the usual forums started to upload images of Ashes of the Singularity running on their machine, and they would say, hey, I'm running this on a Fury, I'm running this on a 290, I'm running this on a 980 or a 980 Ti, or whatever. And they would, of course, then compare those images. Essentially, from what we can understand, the GTX 1080 is indeed doing as AMD are saying, and it's not rendering terrain shaders correctly. It's not functioning correctly. Now, whether that's an issue with Stardock, whether that's an issue with NVIDIA's drivers, whether it's going to be ironed out 2 minutes after I make this video, which is probable because that's generally how things happen, we don't know. But at least for the purposes of the event, it would appear that AMD are telling us the truth. This leads us to a couple of other questions. Firstly, R2 RX 480 is going to be faster than the GTX 1080. Do I think that AMD are telling the truth there? Honestly, I think they are telling us the truth in Ashes of the Singularity. But there are a couple of caveats. The first caveat, of course, is whether the price difference to you is really going to mean that you're going to want to run 2 GPUs rather than 1. Honestly, typically I would rather go with a single GPU, but in this case the price difference is kind of a lot. On the other hand, there are definitely benefits for a single GPU. You know that it's going to run on basically any title, you don't have to worry about patches and all of that stuff, so it's kind of swings and roundabouts. With that said, it is a very tempting upgrade. For example, let's say you've got enough money right now for one RX 480, or you're only running a 1080p display. 3 months from now that changes, then I can certainly understand individuals who would want to go the RX 480 route. Caveat number 2, I would like to have seen other games run other than just Ashes of the Singularity. I would have loved to have seen Doom, for example, or a couple of other benchmarks. Unfortunately, we didn't get to see that. Whether it was because AMD didn't feel confident yet with their drivers, whether it's because they feel that there's still optimization left to go, whether they felt that Ashes of the Singularity shown their GPU in the best light, because typically Ashes of the Singularity does slightly favour AMD's hardware, whether it was just time constraints, whether it was something entirely different, we just do not know. And honestly, that's just kind of how it is with technology or any product. You're always going to want to show a benchmark which shows your GPU in the best light. And honestly, the only thing you can do as a user is wait for official benchmark. I say official, but wait for independent benchmarkings to come out. Now, I guess this brings us to the next point. Do I feel that AMD are being 100% truthful with what they're telling us in terms of the overall performance? Do I think that the cards are going to be extremely competitive? Do I think that they are going to fit within the performance delta? Yes. I do believe that AMD are being honest, because the fact of the matter is it doesn't do them any good to lie. It would generate short-term sales, short-term buzz, but then it would ruin their reputation and trust, which obviously isn't good. And the fact of the matter is, I think generally speaking, companies now are getting a lot better at telling us the truth. There are obviously some incidents where this has not been the case, but just like Nvidia when they were boasting about the GTX 1080's performance, and we were like, really? Can it really do what they said? Obviously it did. And there are reasons behind that. And the other thing is, let's say with Ashes of the Singularity, I guarantee you, 100%, someone will, 110%, I guarantee someone will test this out, these claims out. And this is particularly true when you're given reviewers' guides, when you're given claims by the company and say, hey, this architecture performs this much better than our old architecture. How reviewers' guides generally work is that they will give you the frame rates that they achieved with software in their own testing arsenal. Now, it's down to you as a reviewer to say, okay, I feel that those tests generally benefit or are best on their hardware. So for example, let's say that this is going back a couple of years, or a year or so, but let's say that you got a review guide from AMD and it said to you, hey, Thief running on Mantle achieves this. Well, okay, then you need to decide, do you go with the Mantle results, do you show DirectX 11 results, or do you not include it? Personally, I include Mantle and DirectX 11 results, because honestly it doesn't make any sense to not include Mantle, because if you've got an AMD graphics card, you're going to run, of course, Thief using Mantle, because why would you not? On the other hand, you've also got to then say to yourself, well, that's good, because that shows off what Mantle can do as one of the features of the card, but I also then need to include other benchmarks which may not do so well on AMD hardware or perform neutrally across both, so that viewers get, or readers get, an unbiased opinion of the card, and that is generally what people do. And how review guides generally work, for those of you who don't know, is that obviously they will show the games, the configuration. So for example, it is the latest Call of Duty running at this resolution, running with these graphical settings, and then it will also list the system. So for example, it will be 16 gigabytes of memory, it will be this motherboard with this processor running at this clock speed, and this version of Windows with these graphics card drivers. So yeah, it's a bit of a weird situation, but stuff like this happens a lot in conferences, it happens a lot in live streams. It's not the first time it's happened, it's not the last time it's going to happen, and it just is what it is. I don't blame Nvidia, I don't blame AMD, I just think it is one of those things. It just happened to not render correctly. I don't think it was malicious. I don't think, I don't blame Nvidia, because there are bugs with new GPUs all the time. It's very difficult when you create an architecture to test a GPU on every single game out there with every single different graphical setting and configuration. It's very hard to do that, and then notice rendering issues. So it probably just slipped through the cracks, and then AMD last moment just happened to notice it. It just is what it is. So I don't think there's anything malicious. I think both companies in this regard, obviously there will be a bit of fallout, because that's just how it is. It's very hard for me to be non-biased or come across as non-biased, because it just is what it is. When you're giving your opinion on something, sometimes you either agree or disagree with what a company says. And it's not necessarily you're biased or for or against that company, you just happen to agree or disagree with what they've said in that instance. And as I said, when I went into the Computex live event, I said to myself, I'm expecting a lot, but I'm also prepared for the worst. And I honestly believe that that's what you should be whenever a company tells you this is what we've managed to achieve. Obviously, always have a level of skepticism. And I don't mean that in a negative way, where you immediately badmouth a company when they tell us, hey, this is what they're doing. But don't jump up and down and tell yourself that this is going to give you gold nuggets every time you switch on the machine, because be realistic with your expectations. And if you're still unsure of whether to pick up an RX 480 or a GTX 1080 or any product for that matter, my advice to you, as always, you are the customer, you have the monies, you are the one who makes the decision. I would always advise to check out a review, maybe a couple of reviews, maybe ask folks on forums, get involved. And also, my final suggestion, be sure when you're checking out a review to always look at the games you play. Don't look at other games. Don't look at scenarios that you will not game on. Don't look at, for example, Linux benchmarks if you don't game on Linux. Don't look at high-end benchmarks for, let's say, the Furies and the Titans if you don't game on the Furies and the Titans. And finally, and this is the most obvious one, do your research and you'll be absolutely perfect. But in this instance, I don't think there's anything hinky going on. That's my 2 pennies into the matter anyway. But obviously, over the next month or two, we'll probably be able to test more and we'll actually genuinely know how the cards perform. Until then, we can only take what we've seen at face value. And of course, the tests and the demonstrations that were shown, I've got to say, we did see Doom and other games running, for example, Hitman, we've seen those running on the GTX, the GTX, I was about to say GTX 480 there, that would be going back a few years. The RX 480, we saw those running, and it looks like AMD have managed to very much nail what we'd hoped. And I've got to say, I'm very rarely surprised, but the pricing of the RX 480, the $200 or $229 if you're going with the 8GB model, really surprised me. And I'm very rarely surprised with stuff, but that really did knock me for a loop. I was very surprised by their end pricing. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.